Good morning. It is Monday, February the 21st, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. So after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch and sound as a dollar. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work, thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 21st. I will be a shield for you in battle. I will contend with those who contend with you, and will fight against those who fight against you. Take up my shield and armor, for I will arise and come to your aid. I will brandish my spear and javelin against those who pursue you. I am your salvation. Those who seek your life will be disgraced and put to shame. I will turn back those who plot your ruin. They will be like the chaff before the wind, for my mighty angel will drive them away. The path that your enemies take will be dark and slippery. Because they dug a pit for you, I will cause ruin to overtake them by surprise. The net they hid to entrap you will snare them instead, and they will fall into a pit of ruin. Psalms 35, verses 1 through 10, 119, and 114 through 117. Prayer declaration. Lord, you are a shield to me and my hiding place from my enemies. You will surround me with your shield of protection and will bring down my enemies. I will not be afraid of 10,000 that have set themselves against me, because you are a shield for me. You are a strong tower from all my enemies. Spread your protection over me, and I will rejoice and praise your name. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February 21st. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He is not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he's better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. At least in the United States, most economic resentment is not directed toward billionaires or high-roller financiers, not even corrupt ones. It's directed at the guy down the hall who got a bigger raise. It's directed at the husband of your wife's sister because he earns 20% more than you do. Tyler Cowen. How true and tragic this is. Covetousness is a heart issue, and it reveals itself far more in individual relationships and local community attitudes than it even does in one's disdain for Great Gatsby-like opulence. It is not remedied by your friend having his pay cut, but it is also not remedied by your pay going higher. It is remedied by your faithful obedience to the commandment, "Thou shalt not covet." A focus on your own productivity, gratitude for your own bounty, and genuine admiration for the achievement of others, only these things will purge the covetousness that is so incredibly corrosive to our economic culture. And that was, there is no free lunch. Thank you. And now, sound as a dollar. Take a hard look at that dollar bill in your wallet. Physically, it has not much altered since 1928. But in purchasing power, it's actually a 1956 dime. 40 years ago, $25 a week was a typical starting wage for a white-collar job, and a man earning $10,000 a year could decently house, feed, and clothe a family. A new Chevrolet cost $1,500. A candy bar cost a nickel. The New York Times cost 3 cents. If you saw a penny glinting on the sidewalk, you stooped to pick it up. The Americans of the 1950s knew all about inflation. They knew about the wheelbarrow full of money it took to buy a loaf of bread in Germany in 1923. They knew about the Italian lira and the Brazilian cruzeiro. Weak and unstable countries suffered from weak and unstable currencies. But the dollar, it was an imperishable fact like U.S. Steel or the Latin Mass or the supremacy of the New York Yankees. In the late 1940s, when Americans were plagued by post-war inflation, they persistently described the problem as one of rising prices. Like medieval peasants watching the sun orbit the earth, Americans imagined that it was the dollar that stood still and the cost of a pound of coffee or steak that moved. Money is a series of promises. You give me something I want now, an hour of work, a pound of hamburger, a new dress, and I give you this piece of paper, which you will in turn be able to use to get the things you want. When the value of money drops, promises are broken and expectations are shattered. You took a job in January because you were told you would be given enough dollars to buy this amount of food and that amount of clothing, and you discover in December that the dollars have somehow shrunk. You acted in good faith. You did what you said you would do. but your reward has been tampered with. How? By whom? The American Republic prints up pieces of paper, emblazons them with the symbols of its power and permanence, and on its full faith and credit, declares them to be worth a certain amount. Inflation slyly and surreptitiously diminishes their value. It is an act of betrayal. If you have the nerve to borrow a lot of soggy cash and then use it to buy hard assets, land, grain, metals, art, silver, candlesticks, a book of Austro-Hungarian postage stamps, you could make a killing in the 70s. Forbes magazine published its first list of the 400 richest Americans in 1982. 153 of them owed their fortunes to real estate or oil. On the 1998 list, by contrast, only 57 fortunes derived from real estate or oil. Ordinary people could score an inflation windfall of their own simply by buying a house. Hundreds of thousands of California and Florida bungalows bought in the early 60s for less than $35,000 on 5% mortgages were suddenly tripling and quadrupling in value. What sellers are asking, gasped a California magazine writer, is sometimes staggering. A one-bedroom wooden shack in Benedict Canyon with only 22 by 26 feet of living space goes for $71,000. Why? It's located in the fashionable Beverly Hills post office district. Over the 3 years 1972 to 1975, the median price of a new home in the United States jumped by nearly 50%. Worse than the rise in housing prices was the rise in interest rates. Baby boomers who had grown up in homes financed at 4.5% were by 1975 facing mortgage rates that had passed 9%. In 1950, 7 out of 10 American families could afford the monthly payments on a median-priced new home. By the end of 75, only about 4 of 10 families could. Working Americans were also being squeezed by surging prices of food, clothing, and fuel. The cost of meat, poultry, and fish rose by more than 40% between August 1972 and August 1973. So fast that steakhouse menus arrived with stacks of little white handwritten stickers over the printed prices. I remember being taken out to a dinner as a boy of 12 and scraping off a little mountain of superimposed surcharges to gaze at the primordial price at the very bottom. I felt like Heinrich Schliemann digging through the fragments of forgotten centuries to gaze at a lost world, where a ribeye with a baked potato at a restaurant with red leather banquets cost $5.95. Only twice in the 20th century, 1930 to 1939 and 1970 to 1979, did Americans end a decade poorer on average than they began it. The two slumps could not, however, have resembled each other less. Depressions induced despair. Inflations fogged the atmosphere with paranoia. Depressions usually originate in the disorder of private finance. Inflations are produced by governments. Depressions strengthen the state. Inflations discredit it. Back in a minute. Thank you. In January 1980, consumer prices were rising at a 17% annual clip. The prime interest rate would touch 20% in April, drop, and then return and pass 20% in December. President Carter conceded in February 1980 that inflation was indeed reaching the crisis stage. Business Week, of all publications, editorialized that the time had come for semi-permanent wage and price controls. The U.S., it warned, is in danger of becoming another Brazil, with an intolerably high rate of inflation institutionalized. The result will be an end to the democratic system. Institutionalized inflation, an end to the democratic system, it all seems sickeningly plausible. No eye could penetrate to the bottom of the 1970s economic slump. The dollar seemed to be melting away. It took only 35 of them to buy an ounce of gold in 1970, but 875 to buy an ounce in 1980. $1 commanded more than 4 German marks and fully 360 Japanese yen in 1970. It could be exchanged for fewer than 2 marks and barely 200 yen in 1980. Disaster followed disaster, and the authorities stood slack-jawed, baffled, and apparently helpless. In fact, they were not nearly as helpless as they looked. The United States had consciously chosen to inflate its currency. It made that choice because of the political ideology and personal weakness of the men entrusted with the job of managing the American economy. Their utopianism, their arrogance, and then finally their cowardice, dating back to the day that John Kennedy was elected president of the United States on a promise to get the country moving again. It might seem incredible now that anyone could think the country had been standing still in the 1950s, an era the Americans of the 1970s would wistfully remember as a time of almost perfect economic felicity. But the country had endured 3 recessions in the 50s. The last of them, 1958 to 1960, was the first severe and prolonged slump since the Great Depression. Making matters worse was the fear that the Soviet Union was overtaking the United States economically. That, too, seems incredible now, yet the Soviets were reporting fantastic economic statistics, 10% annual growth and more, and the economists of the day, who found it perfectly plausible that a centrally planned economy could function well, were impressed and frightened. Richard Crossman, the British Labour MP who edited The God That Failed, spoke for the Kennedy coterie when he described his anxiety over, quote, the terrifying contrast between the drive and missionary energy of the communist bloc and the lethargic, comfortable indolence of the Western democracies. Judged in terms of national security, scientific and technological development, popular education, and finally, even of mass living standards, free enterprise is losing out in the peaceful competition between East and West, unquote. The solution, Kennedy and his advisors concluded, was to dash for faster growth by forcing U.S. interest rates down to almost zero and holding them there. We Democrats, the party's 1960 campaign platform declared, believe that the economy can and must grow at an average rate of 5% annually, almost twice as fast as our average rate since 1953. As the first step in speeding economic growth, a Democratic president will put an end to the president's high interest rate, tight money policy. 5% growth. That is the speed of growth recorded in third world catch-up countries that can import technologies and techniques from abroad, not in an industrial leader like the United States. By promising to force march the economy at a double-time pace, the Kennedy Democrats were courting trouble. Low interest rates are very pleasant, but they can also stimulate inflation. Ideally, the Federal Reserve acts like a thermostat. It lowers interest rates and injects cash into the economy during recessions, and it raises interest rates and removes cash during booms, thus preserving a stable, steady price level. But if the Federal Reserve were to continue lowering interest rates and injecting cash during a boom, cash would soon become ridiculously overplentiful and its value would begin to tumble. The Kennedy economists foresaw this price, and they were prepared to pay it. 2 of the economists closest to President Kennedy, the future Nobel laureates Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, argued in a 1960 essay that the United States should willingly accept higher inflation to accelerate growth and push unemployment toward zero. In order to achieve the non-perfectionist goal of high enough output to give us no more than 3% unemployment, the price index might have had to rise by as much as 4 to 5% a year. That much price rise would seem to be the necessary cost of high employment and production in the years immediately ahead. Samuelson and Solow believed that the inflation and unemployment were opposites, like sheep and cattle. The more you had of one, the less you have of the other. As late as 1974, when consumer prices varoomed upward by 12.2%, while unemployment shot past 7%, James Tobin, another Kennedy advisor and future Nobel laureate, continued to insist that each precluded the other and that of the two, unemployment was by far the greater evil. Our economy, like all the others of the modern world, has an inflationary bias. When it operates without socially intolerable levels of unemployment and surplus capacity, prices will drift steadily upward. As consolation, I can only offer my opinion that inflation is greatly exaggerated as a social evil. So the best and brightest invited the inflation monster into the house. At first, he behaved himself and unemployment dropped as promised. But by the middle 1960s, he was testing his claws on the furniture. 2% inflation in 65 rose to almost 3% in 1966, and to more than 3% in 1967. Then the monster began to snarl and bite, 4% in 68 and 69. Still, the leading economic thinkers of the 60s poo-pooed the beast's mounting rage. Unemployment had been driven down to 3.5% in 1969, and President Johnson, already in desperate trouble because of Vietnam and the urban race riots, refused to countenance a recession. The newly elected President Nixon felt exactly the same way. He was urged by the more conservative members of his economic team to cool off the economy before it was too late. I remember 58, he replied. We cooled off the economy and cooled off 15 senators and 60 congressmen at the same time. The president refused to act, and the monster began to smash up the house in earnest. Back in a minute. Thank you. In the 1950s and 1960s, almost every currency in the world, with the interesting exception of the Canadian dollar, was anchored to the U.S. buck. At a rambly old resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, teams of economists and Treasury officials from the United States and its allies had devised a new financial constitution for the planet in 1944. The currencies of the industrial democracies would be defined in terms of U.S. dollars. A Japanese yen would be worth X amount, and there would be so many Swiss francs to the dollar, and so on. The dollar, in turn, was anchored to gold at the rate of $35 to the ounce. The hope of the framers of this economic constitution was to retain the best elements of the old gold standard while avoiding the panics and depressions the gold standard had so often engendered. Bretton Woods constructed the financial equivalent of a school system without examinations. In hope of squelching the destructive speculation of the 1920s and 30s, currencies were carefully protected from the shock of reality, from ever being forced to confront their real standing. Under the pre-1914 gold standard, an inflation in the United States would cause dollar holders to dump dollars for gold. Under the post-1973 system of floating exchange rates, an inflation in the United States would cause the dollar to depreciate against other currencies. But under Bretton Woods, if the United States inflated, other countries were forced to choose. Either inflate at roughly the same pace as the United States, preserving the relative value of the dollar and other currencies, or else blow up an international monetary system from which they benefited much more than the United States. The Bretton Woods system rested on the unflinching willingness of the United States to uphold the integrity of the dollar, but it simultaneously created attractive incentives for American politicians not to do their duty. If those politicians inflated just a little, they could enjoy a nice, if temporary, burst of prosperity without having to worry about any slippage in the dollar on world money markets. The central bankers of Europe would all be compelled to depreciate their currencies at the same rate. As for the depreciation against gold, that too would be disguised for some time because the people who owned most of the world's dollars, American citizens, had since 1934 been forbidden to sell those dollars to buy gold. President Eisenhower understood Bretton Woods' temptations and sternly resisted them. He accepted 3 recessions over his presidency to wring out the last of the wartime inflation. In 1961, Eisenhower handed over to Kennedy a stable but sluggish economy. The national debt was under control, inflation was virtually zero, and all stood ready for sustained non-inflationary growth. Instead, Kennedy and his team reversed the old joke about the central banker taking away the punch bowl before the party gets rowdy. Kennedy's central bankers saw it as their job to slip something into the punch bowl. What it followed was one of the gaudiest, splashiest economic parties in American history, and one of the worst spells in the detox clinic. By 1970, the United States was clearly heading towards some kind of financial crisis. The country's gold reserves were being depleted as foreign central banks wearied of blotting up excess U.S. dollars on international markets and started demanding that the Federal Reserve buy them back. The stock market was slumping. Long-term interest rates were rising. In early 1970, the Federal Reserve, now led by Nixon's friend Arthur Burns decided that action could no longer be postponed. Burns hoisted short-term interest rates to 8.5% and pushed the economy into its first slump in 9 years. He was trying to brake gently to slow the inflation and defend the currency without triggering an election-losing recession. He failed. Although the recession of 1970 was one of the mildest in history, it cost the Republicans dearly in November, just as Nixon had feared. With his own re-election campaign now only 2 years away, Nixon decided there would be no more recessions. Inflation would have to be contained in some other way. At the beginning of 1971, President Nixon granted a television interview to 4 network correspondents to announce a formal surrender. What we're going to do first is have an expansionary budget. We also, according to Dr. Arthur Burns, will have an expansionary monetary policy, and that will, of course, be a monetary policy adequate to meet the needs of an expanding economy. The complacent Burns was as good as his word. White-haired, fond of pipes and tweeds, Burns looked just the way a central banker should look. Perhaps it would have been better for the country if he had dyed his hair pink, fastened a safety pin to his nose, and come to work in black leather. In April 1971, Burns forswore any repeat of his 1970 policy, informing the Senate Banking Committee that another rise in interest rates to defend the dollar would not meet our lasting needs at home or abroad. Still, something would have to be done. Despite the recession, consumer prices had risen at a pace of 5.9% in 1970. The inflation monster was now raging out of control, punching holes in the walls, ripping apart the banisters, dangling the baby out of the second-story window. With higher interest rates precluded, Burns proposed to fight inflation with wage, price, and investment controls. 11 years of unwillingness by Americans to discharge their Bretton Woods responsibilities had vexed and maddened all the system's members, but nobody more than inflation-chary West Germany. In May 1971, the U.S. prices rising at a rapid 7.2% annual rate, the West Germans announced that they'd had enough and quit the Bretton Woods system. Their government would no longer sell marks to prop up the dollar, no longer subject its people to a made-in-America inflation. The dollar must now sink to its own level. It promptly did. Over the next 3 months, it dropped 7.5% against the Deutschmark. With prices zooming, American trade unions demanded tremendous wage increases to protect their membership and employers. Counting on inflation to bail them out, amiably acceded in a series of deals announced over the summer of 1971. Copper workers extracted 28% over the next 3 years. Aluminum and steel workers each secured a 31% raise over 3 years. Rail workers won 42% over 3.5 years. Back in a minute. Thank you. In July 1971 testimony to Congress, Burns ruefully admitted that he'd been working the printing presses like a New York tabloid editor with exclusive photographs of a topless starlet. The money supply had bloated by a disturbing 10% in the first half of the year. Quizzed by hostile Democrats, Burns conceded that perhaps he had been a little slack. But he and his master had learned their lesson in 1970. They were not interested in quieting inflation by vote-losing means. At a press conference on August 4, 1971, President Nixon mused that he had an open mind about the wage and price controls Burns was now aggressively touting. 3 days later, the Bretton Woods system, badly battered by West Germany's defection, began to crack apart. On August 7th, the Joint Economic Committee of Congress released a report recommending a devaluation of the dollar. On August 9, speculators blasted the Swiss franc loose from the Bretton Woods level. It climbed to 4.6 to the dollar, and the Swiss declared that they, too, were seceding from Bretton Woods. The dollar plunged against even the sick currencies of Europe, the Italian lira, the French franc, the British pound. Gold climbed on August 9th to $43.95 an ounce on the free London market. The Swiss traded $50 million for gold in July. The French demanded $191 million worth of gold in August. U.S. gold reserves fell to the lowest level since 1938. The American public did not monitor the gold market, but it knew what a pound of hamburger cost. On August 9, 1971, the Harris poll reported that disapproval of Nixon's economic policies had reached a new high. 73%. If the election were held that day, Nixon would lose to the Democratic frontrunner, Senator Ed Muskie of Maine. It was time for a bold stroke. Nixon helicoptered off to Camp David. He descended from his mountaintop on Sunday, August 15th, to unveil before a national television audience the most startling change in U.S. financial policy since the 100 Days of 1933. Prices and wages would be frozen for 90 days. Foreign governments would no longer be permitted to trade dollars for gold at 35 to the ounce. Foreign imports would be slapped with a 10% surcharge. The post-war economic order was dead. From the point of view of 2000, Nixon's grand gesture fell somewhere between folly and madness. 21st century Americans believe in the free movement of prices in the way that medieval men believed in the efficacy of prayer. But the Americans of 1971 reacted to Nixon's controls ecstatically. The notion that government could control inflation not by ending the inflation, but by forbidding businesses and workers to notice that it existed made good sense to them. In polling history, the 70+% disapproval rating for Nixon's economic policies of early August upended itself into a 70+% approval rating in September. Left-wing economists Arthur Okun, Paul Samuelson, and John Kenneth Galbraith applauded. So, eye-openingly, did business groups like the National Association of Manufacturers, the Chamber of Commerce, and the DuPont and General Motors companies. The Dow Jones average rallied a then appreciable 33 points. The wage and price freeze ended in October. There followed a prolonged period of controls, which the Nixon administration called Phase IL. Companies were forbidden to raise prices, and workers were denied raises unless they could convince the bureaucrats at the Cost of Living Council that the increases in raises were justified. Photographs of earnest price controllers suddenly filled the newspapers, their youthful faces dwarfed by the 5-inch collars charging south from their necklines, their pallor accentuated by the lurid orange and purple of their neckties. They spent their days in Talmudic inquiry. If a union negotiated a price or wage increase in May to go into effect in November, when did the transaction occur, etc. Controls only made sense if one believed that companies had freedom to set whatever prices they liked. The controllers soon discovered how false that assumption was. They targeted the 1,500 biggest U.S. corporations for especially vigilant supervision. Every request for an increase by those companies was carefully scrutinized to ensure that it was motivated by genuine surges in cost rather than lip-smacking greed. The flinty-eyed controllers were mostly devotees of the John Kenneth Galbraith theory of corporate wickedness. Yet of the 4,741 requests for price increases from big companies during the controls, 93% were approved. Baffled, Nixon resorted to another wage price freeze, this one for 60 days in the summer of 1973. It failed even more dismally than the one of 1971. People believe what they have seen, or as magicians understand what they think they have seen. The generation of World War II thought they had seen price controls work in the 40s, and so believed in them. Those who experienced the controls of 71 and 73 as the oil price controls that lasted until 81 saw them fail, and thus they learned to disbelieve. If controls didn't work, what would? The inflation hidden by the 1971 controls resurfaced in 1972. An election-minded Federal Reserve goosed the money supply faster than in any year since 1944. The extra cash was needed to finance, among other things, the huge increase in Social Security payments Nixon signed on October 30, 8 days before the presidential ballot. The conservative economist Beryl Sprinkle, a future member of Reagan's Council on Economic Advisers, warned that Americans ought to get used to a perpetual, sizable inflation on the order of 5%. Walter Heller, the chairman of John Kennedy's Economic Council, predicted permanent inflation in the vicinity of 4%. Paul Samuelson said he would be happy if inflation could be reduced to 4% by the end of the 70s, but doubted that this would be possible. And all of this was before the oil shock of 1973. Back in a minute. Thank you. Controls. The inflation of the 1970s is often blamed, especially by the people who happened to be on duty at the time, on Arab oil sheikhs. It's much closer to the truth to say that the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 were themselves caused by the inflation of the 1970s. Oil prices rose in the 1970s for the same reason that price of gold and houses and coffee rose, because the value of paper money relative to commodities was plunging. As Milton Friedman tirelessly pointed out throughout the decade, a sudden spike in the price of any single commodity will not by itself trigger inflation. If the commodity is sufficiently important, as oil is, a price spike may trigger a recession as consumers are forced to cut back sharply on other purchases. To turn a commodity shock into a decade of inflation demands the all-out, full-time effort of dozens of hardworking public officials. Politicians in the 1970s were usually puzzled by inflation, but they all agreed on one thing: it was somebody else's fault. President Ford believed that inflation was caused by individual overconsumption. In his Whip Inflation Now addresses of October 1974, he urged families to shop more wisely and spend less. To those gluttons who could not spare a morsel, he appealed, "If you can't spare a penny from your food budget, surely you can cut the food you waste by 5%. To discourage overeating, he asked Congress to impose a 5% surtax on families earning more than $15,000. Ford summoned 22 citizens to form a National Whip Inflation Now committee under the chairmanship of Sylvia Porter, the personal finance columnist. Porter's committee crafted a weird reprise of the ill-fated National Recovery Act of 1934, in which private citizens pledged to stop spending their money so recklessly. For business people, I pledge to my customers that to the very best of my ability, I will hold or reduce prices and will buy whenever possible from those who have pledged to do the same. I also pledge to be an energy saver. This signed pledge is evidence of my participation in and support of the WIN program. For consumers, I pledge to my fellow citizens that I will buy, whenever possible, only those products or services priced at or below present levels. I also promise to conserve energy, and I urge others to sign the pledge. For workers, I pledge that I, through my union, will join with my fellow workers and my employer in seeking ways to conserve energy and eliminate waste on the job. I also promise to urge others to sign this pledge. Back in a minute. You. The quadrupling of the price of oil in 1973-74 pushed the whole world into the most severe recession since the Second World War. That would normally have sufficed to stop the inflation, and even in the 1970s it did manage to slow it. Not for long. The governments of the West chose immediate reflation. By May 1975, Arthur Burns announced that he would err on the side of ease in his monetary policy for 1976, as if he had not already been easy enough. Burns reignited American inflation too late to save his friend Gerald Ford. Ford's challenger, Georgia Governor James Earl Carter, campaigned as a new, sobered-up sort of Democrat. His running mate, Walter Mondale, was a cheerfully unreconstructed liberal. In his acceptance speech at the 1976 convention, Mondale disregarded the printed text, which reproduced John F. Kennedy's exhortation to get the country moving again, and blurted out instead what he really thought. Let's get this government moving again. In office, Carter reverted to type, spending wildly and then trying to control the inevitable inflation with price controls. He asked Congress to enact new controls on consumer prices, on energy, and on medicine. The Democratic Congress eagerly accepted his spending proposals, but rebuffed his controls. If American maturity was the favorite cliché of the writers of the 1950s, W.B. Yeats's Second Coming was the favorite of the 70s. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. In the first year of Carter's presidency, the dollar plunged by more than 25% against the Swiss franc and more than 13% against the German mark. In July 1977, gold passed the $200 an ounce level for the first time. Still, the dollar plunged. 1978, consumer prices were now rising at 12% a year. as fast as during the first oil shock. 1979, gold broke $300 in July and ended the year at $524. Consumer prices rose by 13% in 12 months. After tax, after inflation, wages dropped by an average of 5% in 1979. The general price level had doubled in only 8 years. The United States dropped to 8th place in income per capita among the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, behind Norway. 1980, gold passed $600 on January 3, $700 on January 15th, $750 on January 17th, $800 on January 18th, and $875 on January 21st. That month, consumer prices rose at an annualized rate of 16%. Back in a minute. Thank you. The decade was ending in what looked and felt like economic apocalypse. It was no excitable hysteric, but the reserved Alan Greenspan, then chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, who told Congress at the decade's midpoint, capitalism is in crisis. The United States, Greenspan said, had arrived at the point of discontinuity, a point at which it was obliged to choose either to turn back toward the principles of market economy or to proceed forward towards something ominous and unprecedented. And that was the chapter Sound as a Dollar from the book How We Got Here, the 70s. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that seeks consensus. He is subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He's informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He's impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He's deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He's skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.